All right, welcome to today's Lunch and Learn. We are very excited to have you here with us today, but a little bit about us before we get started. Virtual Coffee's mission is to be a welcoming tech community that allows room for growth and mentorship at all levels and to create meaningful opportunities for learning, leadership, and contribution for everyone. So to find our code of conduct, our events, or learn more, you can check out our site, virtualcoffee.io. We're really glad to have everybody here with us today, especially Mark Noonan, who is going to be running this Lunch and Learn on component testing in Cypress 10, which I am super excited about. Just a little bit about Mark. He's a senior engineer at Cypress.io, and he works as a program developer for People Making Progress, which is an Atlanta-based nonprofit serving adults with developmental disabilities at home, work, and in the community. So I'm going to turn it over to Mark now. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thanks, Becca. Hi, everybody. Yeah, I think I will just kind of dive into the presentation and share my screen, and we can go from there. Becca's right. Please do ask questions as we go. Actually, before we start, I'll say that I've presented on other things plenty, but I actually haven't done that many presentations or talks about component testing itself in Cypress. So if there are questions as you go, it's actually useful to have them so I can kind of dial in the talk a little bit. And afterwards, any feedback people have would be fantastic. All right, let's share here. So we'll look at component testing in Cypress 10. I'm going to use Vue as our example, but this applies equally to React and Angular and stuff like that. And yeah, Becca explained the organizations I work with. So let's see. Yeah, we'll start with an overview. Then we'll do some practical work around let's make a component, let's make a test. There's a few ways we can do that actually can kind of be interactive as we set it up. And then there's a possibility for some bonus content at the end. I have some non-realistic but pretty cool examples that we might be able to get into that I'll talk about. So I'm not going to talk really about how to set up a Vue app that we're going to use as our example, and I'm not going to talk about setting up component testing itself in Cypress. Although since I made this slide originally, setting it up has actually sort of become automated. So we're not missing much by skipping that. You can kind of just click setup and follow the instructions. And so we'll try to take a overview approach where we talk about just, what are the differences with component testing and end-to-end testing. And before we even get into this, let's talk about the testing itself. I don't want to assume everybody here is used to automated testing web applications. So the general idea is what Cypress has been known for up to recently is you have a test you write that knows how to visit your web app somewhere. And you'll go to a certain URL, and then we're going to have the automated test script behave as a user, click things, look at things, inspect the text, and see if everything is what we expect, and then move through flows. So if you have a website that takes money, it's really important to have testing to confirm that users can give you money and that users can log in, kind of things that if they were broken, your business wouldn't be functioning are really important to have end-to-end tests around. And so Cypress does that with a sci.visit command. And then component testing is a very, very similar experience, but we're going to mount an individual component from the website and just test that. But it's still running in the same browser. It's still visible to you the way that it would be in an end-to-end test. It's still kind of mounted into a page. It just happens to be mounted into an empty page, which means we can directly use its props and its slots to set up the state that the component's in and test it like that. So I have an example repo. There are two examples. We're going to start with the simpler of the two. And so this is running a application here. Let's also go to that. This is just a login page. That's all there is to the app. And Cypress should be opening up. We're going to choose component testing to check it out. When we close Discord. So we'll open up component testing and we will look at what we get, which is a list of specs in Cypress. And each one of these goes to a particular component. So we have a button like that. So we can see it's got its tests and it's mounted and it's showing it all by itself. We can choose the other components in our application and watch their tests run as well. And so the main difference between that and our end-to-end testing is that that initial command is mount. So it requires like being understanding of what are the components in your application and all that, versus visit, which will just go to, for example, this is the localhost URL that we just looked at in the browser. And then I scaffolded the other examples of visiting different things as well. So we're going to an actual website that has things that we can test. And so other than that, the bulk of the things you'd be doing would be the same. And you might already be used to testing components with something like Jest, where you can kind of mount the component in the simulated browser. And we'll probably talk a little bit about that too. All right, so let's get this back going.
We've got a question in the chat from Jörn. He said that he used to set up Storybook and use that to do component testing with Cypress. So is this a complete replacement for that?
If the only reason that you use Storybook is so that you can kind of do sci.visit and then go to a component in your Storybook and like check it, if that's all you're doing with Storybook, this is like an alternative to that. There's no reason to deploy and like, you know, have set everything up in Storybook and then visit. It's also fine if that's working for you. It's not like you need to undo that and start doing this, but it would remove that layer because now you can also just see the component in the browser in Cypress. So having, like if you were starting fresh today, it would be hard to see that you would want to use a second tool to like mount your component there with its rules and then, you know, get your Cypress components, get your Cypress end-to-end tests to visit that Storybook. But a lot of people have Storybook for multiple reasons. And so if you already have Storybook for other reasons and this, you know, form of testing is working for you, this wouldn't be like a reason to change it immediately, but it might change what you do for new components depending on who looks at your Storybook and why you have it. Okay, so we're going to put a component together. Yeah, let's do it. Let's talk about the three things we're going to do. So as we make the component, we're going to define it in the test first, and then write the component to satisfy the test. And it's just going to be a real simple, like transform some text to make it fancy. As we have a parent that uses it, we're going to move up a level and test it from that parent. And that'll be a little bit different than the component test we write for the fancy text component, because the parent is not really responsible for what fancy text does. It's just responsible for using it correctly. And then in the end-to-end test, we will come along and see that, okay, when I visit the application, is this thing visible? Is this thing not being covered by something else that's part of the context of the actual full page? Maybe a third-party pop-up or something could cover it. So if we expect it to be visible on page load, we can check it from there as well. But the most detailed test is going to be this internal component test. Cool. Any other questions before I dive into the example?
And we do have another question from Tom asking, how well does this work with Ionic Components?
That's a good question. I haven't tried it with Ionic. I do have like a Vue Ionic project I've worked with. And so the fact that the components are not really that different from other frameworks shouldn't make it that difficult. But I wonder if we would need like custom mount stuff to make sure we load in all of the Ionic things that it does. So yeah, not sure exactly how well it works with Ionic, but I don't see any blocker that would make it like, hey, you have Vue components that Ionic is using, then you should be able to test those Vue components somehow with Cypress.
We got one more question from Nick. Is the parent like the test renderer?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question. Nick, do you want to unmute and yeah.
You're not unmuted, Nick.
I was unmuted in one spot. Now I'm unmuted in both. So you're saying like, because obviously the fancy text is the component we're testing, but it's wrapped in a parent component. So that's what basically bootstraps it to be able to be tested, right? So like that's what I mean in terms
Oh,
of
cool.
like, is it the test renderer?
Oh, that's fine. No, it's the mounted, the parent is really just like as part of our example. So you can test it directly.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But there's like a onion-like quality of expanding layers. And actually, this is maybe something I should move further up in the talk. One of the reasons we'll talk about these three scenarios is that it's really common to sort of want to over-test at every layer of your components once you start doing something like this, because typically components are using other components. And one of the things that happens is you get like near duplication between different layers. Some tests will be going to fully check the deeply everything that a component renders. Other tests will check only some things like a health check. And so I've sort of settled on, if you are in component testing and you have one component spec for every component, you really start to understand, here's what it's responsible for. So fancy test is responsible for like this one thing that it does. And it also has a certain set of props. So we want to use the props of the component to mount it. And then what I've seen is variations of, oh, I'm using a parent component and I don't want to go too deep into fancy text. So I'm going to test, did it pass the right prop with the right name? And that's like double testing the prop name that we already tested. Really, I just want to know is, did the text get on the page? And I don't care what component rendered it, what it was called. I don't care what its API was. I just want to know, hey, this parent is responsible for getting this output on the page. Or in some other way, like detecting, is everything in the right state? And then the component level test for the individual pieces will be like, is the component correctly matching the state that we just detected it's in? This is kind of easier with the examples, but in order to like do component testing on more than a trivial basis, you end up thinking a lot about where does the test want to live. So let's try, we're going to try adding it in this simple project, and then I'm going to flip to the more complicated one. So we'll come back to the E2E spec that just visits localhost. And I'm going to say under login, I want this new component to ultimately render. I'm going to move some invisible things around my screen that are coming from Zoom. We'll close everything here. And we'll look at what our components are. I'm going to say welcome.view, which is this thing that renders out. Actually, I don't think we're going to even get to that. So let's say login form is going to ultimately have this new text. And just for the sake of argument, make sure everything is working correctly. Cool. So there it is. So this is completely made up just so we can dive into it. And in that layer, this would be the parent component. So if we were to switch to the component test and look at the login form, it's got a bunch of specific tests that it's running, but it's also rendering out this thing. So our goal is to make a new component called fancy text and use it inside of the login form component.
Mark, when you move over to the Cypress test runner, can you zoom in a little bit?
Oh, yeah.
Thanks. That's
But
better.
we can make it take up more of the thing too and zoom in. Is that better? It's probably a lot better.
Yeah, that's a lot better.
Cool. All right, so I'm just going to copy one of our simple components. Fancy text. Doesn't need a style. Will need some props though. So let's first of all say it's going to be span. And that's that. We'll set it up through the spec. So we have a new component, and I want to try, this is like my favorite new thing, where we should have fancy text.view showing up here and be able to create a spec. So that step of figuring out like exactly what to do to import it and mount it. Cool. This file gets created for us through Cypress if we happen to be working in this way and we want to do that. We can just make a change into this file here. It should refresh for us. And now we have a spec that we can start with that mounts the component, and we can click through to go through here. So this is like really nice for maybe your first couple of specs or something, just to have things set up for you without having to copy and paste code. And we sort of wish this would have a prop for text. So I'm going to try to do like a little bit of TDD, test-driven development style thing, where I'm going to say text, hello. And my basic thing is I want this to be existing in the document and be visible. So we'll get this to fail, and then we'll work on making it pass. And in order for it to be fancified, this is what I'm doing. So we're going to expect the component to like put some tildes around it. And so we have a new component, it's expecting this, but all it's got is this, so there's nothing there. And if I were to come around here without even putting a prop and just put literally the thing that makes it pass into the component, we have a green test. And so obviously we can't do that. We want to do something with props. And in view 3, let's take a quick look here. Do we have a good example? Yeah, it's this define props. We're going to say text. And then here we can put props.text. And so now we're still passing. And if we wanted to make sure everything is working, it's breaking. And so this is a very, very basic spec that confirms the output of the component is correctly transforming this thing that we passed in as a prop. And the expectation here is that in mount, we are setting the stuff that we're about to test. And if we're doing like, a store that needs to be interacted with or touches the router, we can sort of provide those things here too. But the main thing is this is working as we expect. And now we can move up a level. So we said like login form is supposed to use this. So if I come over to login form, we can import that new component. And we can put it in here. And pass it text, and we'll just put in something hi from login. We got a double import, that's nice. And so we can see it's displayed down here, and our expectation of like what we should test from the login form test is going to be to do with like, what's it responsible for doing? Okay, it's supposed to put a certain kind of content in there. So we'll know if it's using the component correctly by the user-facing contents of the page.
We've got a couple of questions.
Yeah, let's
Mark,
get into
if
those.
you want to pause. Jörn, do you want to unmute and ask your question, and then Nick?
Sure. So thanks, first of all. I was wondering whether you could also check for a specific component to be available, like not just the text, or can I also ask for, is there a component random text, for example, if I have a component called random text which creates some random stuff in there?
I have an example of that kind of at the end in the more extreme buy-in to component testing. But in the login form, in this one, for example, I don't care what the name of this is. Like, I don't think this test is checking what is the login form responsible for rendering. And so in this context, to me, like the name fancy text is a implementation detail that, like, from a user perspective, we wouldn't care about. But sometimes you do have cases like that. And what I normally do is a data sci attribute. So like, yeah, fancy, like you would then do a selector for this if you really wanted to like just barely check if the component exists. And
Okay.
yeah, that would be, I'm gonna actually make that test. So let's comment this in here. So that'd be my suggestion, but I do have like an entire ridiculous repo of like, hey, what if we did buy into wanting to validate components by name throughout the entire tree of our page? I don't know if that's really practical unless people wanted to like fully leverage the maximum reusability in their tests, but I thought it was really fun to try, and I will definitely show you.
Okay, got that. So my other question was actually based around that, because I guess this this all of that works with React, Vue, Svelte, Angular, all these component frameworks that you know. But if I create my own component framework, what do I need to do? Will you touch on that as well?
That might be a bit advanced for like what we're covering in this one, but we do have docs around like, oh, you use a custom dev server and a custom bundler, and like what can you write for your mount command? And I can sort of show you where, like in this project, we have defined like how we're handling mounting. Let's double check here. So this mount command is not like built into Cypress and it works for every framework. We're importing a specific mount command for the framework that we're using. And so it would be possible to look at how Vue test utils, which is underlying the Vue testing implementation in Cypress, how do they mount a component, and it basically just attach it to a DOM element. And if you can look at, for example, the way that we did Svelte, which is just about to come out, is we looked at what are existing testing solutions for Svelte, how do they mount into the DOM? Let's use that strategy so that we can, you could even do it before Cypress supports it. So if you do have your own framework or something, and you know how does it compile components and get them into the DOM, you should be able to write a custom mount command and use it the same way.
Okay, thanks. That's then something that how I could do that. Or I was just under the impression that maybe you could also have like JSX in there, and then whatever it expands to, you just eval that basically somehow. And yeah, but then this makes sense to have this extra around it, like your runtime basically.
Yeah, and you can
in
also
that mount then. Okay.
Yeah, you definitely can,
Thanks.
like within mount, you can pass it some JSX too if you set this up as a TSX file, which I may have an example of later, but that's internally in Cypress, that's what our tests do, because sometimes you want to put like a little space around the component you're mounting or something. So yeah, there's a lot of possibilities to extend it and do different things.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Sure.
Go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, it's just a quick question, Mark, because I don't want to derail the demo too much, or the presentation. But
No, it's cool.
When I worked at Dev2, I put Cypress in place, and I put Cypress testing library in place, which is like, if anybody's used React testing library or similar libraries, there's a whole family of them. But that works for end-to-end tests, but I'm assuming they would still be available in the component tests. So like you could do like sci.find by role and stuff, like it would,
yeah,
it's
exactly
applicable. Okay, perfect. Awesome.
Yeah, it's really good. It's I use testing library a lot, and I like find by role and get by label text and all that stuff. So exactly. And I think our other example probably has that. This is going to be like a preview of. Yeah, so this is another. This is using exactly that.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, so let's assert this data attribute first of all. Let's kind of move back into the example. Unless there's more questions, Becca, that popped up right now.
No, we're good. Thank you.
So just for urine, this is like the way that you would do that. And with testing library, you can like change what it thinks of as a test ID. So you can be like find by test ID fancy would get this to work as well. Be visible. And actually this can be our starting point for like, sure, like a minimally satisfactory test here. It finds the span and it thinks it's happy with it. It's visible. And so if this was a component that didn't take any props, that was just like, hey, we want to make sure the login button is everywhere. But we actually don't want to, reference the login text everywhere or anything like that. We just know if this component is there, we're happy. This would actually, to me, be enough for a shallow check in the middle of a user flow that you're actually doing something else, but you expect these things to exist. These data attributes are totally fine for that. In this case, login form is also responsible for putting this text into it. So I would, from login form, also kind of want to know sci.contains. Whatever that was. Cool, so that's there. And I like putting should be visible everywhere. So that's our kind of passing test from the perspective of login. And really, from the end-to-end test, these three things are going to be the same. So we have like a basic example end-to-end test in here that I made. Yeah, it does nothing except visit. So it just goes to whatever's there. And we can copy that line over and go here to end-to-end testing. And find our example. Cool. So it's expecting this as well. And so this more minimal check from the end-to-end level, at this level especially, the composition of the components shouldn't matter. If your end-to-end tests can pass in a framework agnostic way and in an architecture agnostic way, that lets you have like tests that actually are able to be rerun if you refactor the code. And component tests are inherently a little bit bound to the structure of your components. So that boundary of like, I would actually like this form test. I'd like this to pass in a way that would allow me to refactor completely. Like if I didn't have this data attribute here, I don't really care, right? If I decided, oh, I'm actually not using fancy text anywhere except this one place, why don't I just put the text into the component here? I really would like a refactor like this to work, because deep down what we're checking is not, does this component render this other component? What we're checking is, does the login form produce this effect for the user? And at this level, we don't care at all about the internals. But here, where we expect someone else to have to use this, a developer has to consume this, perhaps multiple places in our code base. Here, we really care that like, yeah, this file name even should still match, right? This import path should be the same. This text property should have the same name. That's like core to whether another developer can use this. So we'll move forward a little bit. This is kind of what I was getting towards, where like if you go all in and every component has a test, there's like one place that even from an end-to-end test, if you inspect the DOM here, you can figure out which component renders and is responsible for which piece of the DOM. And that's where to test that. And then if other components above it are using it, you can do more and more minimal checks as you go up to just be satisfied that they're using it correctly. and stop the near duplication, which is like death. So hard to know if it's safe to delete something, or maybe it's the only place that that particular part of the component was tested. So I've really come around to one component spec for one component as much as I can, and thinking a lot about the actual responsibilities of each component. So here's some do's and don'ts, and I do think we're going to have time to get into the more complicated examples. In component testing do's, use the API, use the props, use the slots, use everything you need to. Do things that are directly owned by the component. As much as possible as the users from the user's perspective, so that refactors don't require you to mess with your tests as little as you can. Events, I don't have an example of an event in here, I don't think, but you can do like a spy. I'll have events in the next one, I think, but you can do a spy that will tell you if the event handler was called. You can alternatively like check the event name and look at the framework's way of emitting events. And so the event, what's more important is the event handler is called. And that's a framework agnostic concept. So your tests, if you move from React to Vue, which Cypress has done, and now we have component tests that are in like 2 frameworks because we're supporting a design system that has designs that apply to 2 different applications. And we have component tests that are minimally framework specific and as much as possible is generic. So yeah, asserting direct child's components like we talked about this, and then working your component test into every possible state that the component's responsible for. So a form that can be valid, a form field that can be invalid, or like, you know, password can be shown or not, things like that. Organizing your component test into in this set of states, my component is responsible for this set of things. Is a good way to keep track of not missing any nooks and crannies of the user experience that could go wrong. For the don'ts, like we said, prop names and values. This is actually a really common thing of prop names or computed properties or methods, like unit testing them one by one. So ideally, those things have some effect on the user that you can check, and it matters to the user what the output is, but it doesn't matter like what an internal method name is. I think I already broke this one in my example that like, well, not exactly. Okay, so the HTML that's in a component, right? That's not another component tag. I don't think I explained this. This is what I mean when I talk about directly rendered by the component. So the form element here, this text here is like directly rendered by this component. And in the other places, it's calling other things. And this is the boundary where we're like, we can lighten up on the tests for login form, depending on how much we want to test about the interactions of these components, versus like login form is the only thing responsible for this HTML. Login form is the only thing that's going to make a real form element here. And if we're testing accessibility and we want to say inputs must be in forms or something, the login form test is where we would assert stuff like that, because it truly owns this part of the content. And then duplicating assertions between layers is where the scary near duplication stuff can happen. And first we have to think if you really need to retest something at a higher level. And if you do, you can actually just like make a function that does it. So at least you're defining in one place the truth about that state. And similar, yeah, internal methods don't need to be tested. Let's switch now to the more complicated example. We're going to stop that Cypress. And we're going to start this example app that I made. That is specifically to kind of see about using Cypress for end-to-end and component testing, like how much is really the same. So the way to look at this is a single list item is probably the smallest component. And we have some component tests for it to just say, you know, here's the types of things that it can do. And there's a lot of custom code in here. It's all like userland code. I didn't modify Cypress to be able to do this, but I did set up like a spaghetti rat's nest situation of helpers to let me test component states by name and kind of do what had been suggested with Yarn. But to get a look at what this actually is, this is the View app you probably know and love if you've like created View apps before. And I've just added some extra things to it and split some things out into subcomponents so that we can look at them. So as you can see, we've done some fancy stuff here too. And this is just for the purposes of like, oh, there's a pretend login flow up here, things like that. How would you really do this if you were fully bought into component testing? And probably the way to start this is to look at the end-to-end tests for the main page. So the home page, we're going to watch this run, and it's going to actually like check a bunch of stuff. Cool. So we have like 313 lines of test assertions and commands and stuff. And we can see occasionally this like within and get component logged in the command log. So that's our first clue. The test file for this, we go into our like Cypress E2E folder. The test file is really small. This is the two tests that we saw here. Query param is passed and the contents on a visit. And so this is using a command I made up and added to this project to say, hey, we're going to validate components in certain states. And we're going to validate that we got the error we expected. And we're going to say this thing shouldn't exist. So validate and get component are not parts of Cypress. They're custom commands in this repo that I can share. But this is more about like helping it to sink in that component tests and end-to-end tests are really both user-focused in how they can check things. And this works through like a horrendous object of validators that looks quite like a page object pattern if you've done that in testing. But the purpose of extracting things into this, actually, let's go all the way back down to hello list item. So it's got some options because there might be some certain states, like if it's active or not. So the important thing is we end up with assertions. And basic Cypress commands underlying everything. But then it means when I come around to like I wanted to work on that list item component, what I'm really doing is like calling that same validator. So this idea of that it's true that in a certain set of content, we get different behavior. We can come along to the side-by-side like hello list item, and it's mount the component, and then it's validate with certain test content. Does the test still pass? This is like a little bit inconvenient for like reading the test and understanding exactly what it's doing, because the spec file becomes more, hey, I'm organizing calls to this component, to this function that are actually scaffolded here. But what ends up happening is as you go up the component tree to something that uses list items, we can make assertions about what it's doing with its test content. We go to a header bar, which has a lot of other things. It logs in, it has different state here, and it could still end up reusing, hey, by the way, in the header bar, home is supposed to have the active state. So call the validator for the active state of the home of the list item and expect it to have the content home from the header bar. And so this is not probably how you want to do a project. Like there are so many internal details of knowing the component names, but as the way to think about what your component test should look like, this idea of states of each component, distinct states, and the content you expect. And then from the layers above, all that's really changing is not the correctness of the component, but the content. And one of the things that's bad about this pattern that I'm showing in the example here is I don't actually really need to check deeply all the time. Like when I come around to the app, and the app is a component itself. So this is a component test on app.view, and that's doing everything an end-to-end test would do, just because it's so self-contained. But we probably don't really need to go into every single list item and do a full deep check like this from an end-to-end test or from a component test. But we can, it's fast. And we can opt into it if we have a particular situation that we need to do a deep check on a component. We can always look at the component test and go, boy, I really wrote a complicated login form test. And now I'm writing an end-to-end test for a certain scenario. And that's when I would be like, okay, don't put everything in this complicated validator pattern. But when you have a non-trivial component test that you think has like applications from end to end, when you have a non-trivial test that's like, okay, I am an admin, I am a regular user, I am a customer user. Like in each of these situations, there's a behavior of a complicated form that should be checked. And I wrote the form in a component fashion, so I've got component testing coverage for the form. Rather than writing an end-to-end test that starts from scratch and tries to assert everything, you can borrow that deep check because it's part of your login or your payment process or something important. So you do want to check it deeply every time. You can look through the component test for what's the correctness of the state, and then make a shared function that you can call multiple times to check it. So I've like gone really deep on this. Are there questions at this point about this hilariously over the top pattern?
We do have a question in the chat from Jörn, not about this. It happened a little bit ago. I don't know if you have access to the chat and can read that, Mark.
Oh yeah,
I think
let me
it's
take a look.
easier to read than to have me try and read it out loud.
Oh, cool. So if you have a transpilation step to have sci.mounts, transpile that to sci.mounts for view in React, yes. So the question is is if you have a transpilation step for two things, could you have the same specs and tests for both frameworks? Yes, it pretty much you can. It's a little bit inconvenient to have like JSX transpilation for React and Vue in the same repo, but we have done it for that library that is, I don't think I have the code that I can show, but the Bart who works at Cypress kind of hacked together the necessary setup to really do kind of this type of pattern where, you know, you have a component that mounts the React version and runs the validation for it, and you have a component spec that mounts the Vue version and runs the validation for it. So they're side by side, they're in the same project, and their user-facing behavior is the same. So the API should be the same in the React version and the Vue version of a design system component that we expect to use in two totally separate React and Vue apps. The goal is to, even though you're in different frameworks, provide you the same events and the same prop names and stuff like that. So I can follow up with you, Jörn, and like get our design system repo. I think it's public. I think we can share that. And show how Bart configured that to work. I don't know the exact endpoint of the work that he was doing on it, but I've seen our design system and its two sets of tests, and they're really similar to kind of, I guess, a little bit to the more practical use case for this pattern, where you might want to start to nest things in validators because you definitely need to use it twice. And I will find the GitHub for this. How is it not the first result? That's disappointing. So I'll find the GitHub and I'll link that kind of in the chat after this. But yeah, that's like, you know, what took me a while, and I think it's taken us a while collectively to realize with component testing, is how similar it is to end-to-end, and how there can be this kind of crosstalk where you can move coverage easily between one and the other when they're both in the same framework, depending on like how fast you need the feedback, how much it is end-to-endy, like if it relies on external data or not. You can kind of choose where to put the coverage. And this repo helped me discover like the true depth of running all your end-to-end tests from component tests. Let me go back to the slides for a second here, and let's just round it up and maybe have some other Q&A. So yeah, reasons I like component tests. It's a good place to specify all of a component's behavior. You get a lot of coverage built in because you have to use the components API, and that's how you mount it. So you're automatically, implicitly covering those things being stable. When I start with the component spec, I write things that are more prop and event based, because those are easy to test and easy to like understand. And I try to like maybe interact less with the router directly in an application and not touch the store as much, at least not by default. I kind of hit those things when I can't do it with props and events. E2E tests from like that are focused on, hey, can a user do something? Don't have to also check, hey, is the DOM completely deeply accessible and correct in every moment of this flow? So I think it can declutter some component tests or some end-to-end tests if you can let the component tests focus on the correctness of the markup, for example, for accessibility. And maybe end-to-end tests would still focus on heading order, because heading order requires multiple components side by side and making sure that they're doing the right things. So not that you can't do a deep check from an end-to-end test, but some of them can be avoided and make your end-to-end tests faster. I like the workflow a lot that we just showed of making a component by itself and rendering it in Cypress and seeing it, getting it right, moving it into its context in the app. And so the work that I do now, and like I did a blog post just the other day about moving to Cypress from using component test as a Cypress user last year. This workflow is really, really nice for me. And what's left over is a test. Like I want to get the component into all of the states anyway, so I can see them and build them. And I make some assertions kind of in order to do the test, but all of the work for mounting with the props and building the component and everything except the assertions is just in order to help me see the component easily without having to like make a fake page in my app that would render it, or do a storybook or something like that, because I can just see it and write out the states and set the props for those states in the test. So I use this like as the default for making new components. And when we get new hires at Cypress, like this is the process that we kind of onboard people to. And so I kind of really like that the test, when you work this way, your test is almost like a leftover artifact that just kind of in the background continues to give value over time. But it's not a separate thing you have to go and write at the end of your component development. So here's some stuff. Oh yeah, the last time I gave a similar presentation was this. Let's get rid of that, and I'll put a real link in there for where, actually we don't even need it because we'll just link to the slides directly. But here's the things that I think are reasonable resources if you want to learn more about component testing or Cypress in general. This is totally new. This is a Cypress tutorial that some people in our developer experience team worked on last year and just released not long ago. So it's official, long example of how to use Cypress and get started with it. I have no idea if it covers component testing because it was predated it. But I think it's really cool and worth checking out if you don't already know about it. I don't think we've like, I don't know, pushed it from a marketing standpoint or anything. So it's just there. And these are not related to what we just did, but I super recommend checking out this talk about how screen reader users navigate the web. and basics of accessibility, because these are both things that I want people to be testing in their components. Probably should have used an accessibility example in building out the component. I think that's occurring to me as like what to do next. But cool. All right. So yeah, feel free to donate to people making progress, by the way. That's the type of thing that I normally put at the end of talks. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing here, and feel free, if anybody has questions or thoughts, or if you got inspired and you wrote like a little haiku, like now is the time to share.
Didn't know there was an assignment to write a haiku during the talk, Mark.
Sometimes I say it in case, you know, because I don't think I would feel comfortable sharing one if someone didn't invite me.
Anybody out there want to share their haikus? I think we'll have to save that for a different day, but you are invited to share yours by Joe. So
thank you, Joe. Yeah, I think Nick was our best bet, but it looks like he had to split.
all right. Well, are there any last questions? We got a couple minutes if anybody has anything. Thank you so much, Mark. You covered a lot of questions and a lot of really interesting stuff here. I am a big fan of Cypress, so I was glad to be here.
I meant to actually say at the start that I'm no Becca when it comes to talking about Cypress. I don't have a lot of the great things that Becca does. So yeah, we can maybe talk later about how I can like improve the fun level of these presentations and the stakes. I feel like your talks have a lot of good stakes.
Well, I have to say that I had to up the level because last year when I gave my Cypress talk at KCDC, someone fell asleep. And so I thought I must make this very exciting and add Mission Impossible, because how else would you do that?
Yeah, it's like really cool. And it was, I think your talk at KCDC was like a little bit late on Friday, or maybe that was a different talk.
It was the last talk on the last day. So
I remember that. Yeah, you gotta give people some tension.
Yeah, so it's good now. I enjoy talking about Cypress, and I want to check this out. I am very excited to check out component testing.
Joe, your suggestion's amazing to test a confetti gun component.
Seems like the right way to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. I've done confetti in professional work previously, which was awesome.
I feel like there's a story there.
We just had a designer who was like, okay, here's a multi-step questionnaire, and when you're done signing up, put some confetti. And I was like, okay. And I probably use like something called confetti JS or whatever. But it's like in a really dry, otherwise like completely dry medical app for like your surgery appointments and stuff. And then when you completed the like steps to like read all your documentation or something, you got some confetti.
Nice. I know if you complete a task on Asana, there's like a little unicorn that like floats across the screen. I like the unicorn.
I've never completed a task, so I wouldn't know.
Do you actually know or have a good strategy other than what you just presented with the data CI stuff for these random things? Because I really love creating stuff that does something randomly, because there are so many funny things that come out of that.
Yeah. So how do you mean strategy for that?
Yeah, like just making sure that it's not always the same text that gets generated or something like that. So for example, I had footers where you hover over the text, and then it always changed like into made with love by the people at somewhere, and then it could change to made in the mines of Moria by the people of, or by the humans of whatever, and things like that. So that was that's always fun to see and use as a user, but I find it quite hard to test these things if it's so random.
Yeah, it depends on the source of the randomness, I guess. If you have like a defined array of options, you can sort of like check those with Cypress. I think there's a lot of like, and there's a couple of community packages as well that will help you like, hey, we don't typically recommend doing tests that pass or fail conditionally, but if you have a case where like it's got to be one of a set of things, yeah. Or you can have a really loose regex for like, it should say made in somewhere by something, and that would be enough for like checking the health of your footer. And you can do a CITA contains with a regex to match if you felt like it.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Thanks
All right.
again for the talk. There's lots of information. Great thing. I have 2 days on a component library that I work on, and they don't really do testing yet. So I will push that into the knowledge share sessions that we have next week.
Feel free to talk to me anytime. We see each other in the co-working room anyway, Aaron. But like, I'm happy especially if you've got a funky situation with like a custom framework or something, like I'm interested. So that'd be great. Oh yes,
I don't have it. I'm just curious how to do that stuff. And I think like I probably will try out Solid.js in the near future, and I'm not sure whether that's supported yet. So
yeah, I'm afraid to even bring up Solid and things like that. We're getting Svelte out the door this week, and then we'll see see what's next. And to answer Joe's question, yeah, you can use Faker, and I think if you use Faker in your app and you use Faker in Cypress and you seed the same thing in Faker, you would be able to know that you were getting this, like check the same value.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Mark. This was really informative, and I am excited to be able to share this with more people. So, sorry, trying to keep up with the chat there. So thanks again for being here and giving us this lunch and learn. We'll go ahead and post this on YouTube as soon as we're able, and we'll talk to you all soon.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for all the great questions. It was awesome.